Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, it's been quite a hectic week. We have quite a bit to get through, and a lot of it is actually domestic within the heart of the empire news. And of course, there was an election day this week that was November 2nd. Not really anything significant except New Jersey and Virginia had gubernatorial elections, which are the only thing that would really register on the national radar. Some cities had like mayoral elections, but again, the when it comes to the idea of national politics and how that even spills into international politics, it's just the two, and specifically, I'd say the one gubernatorial election that matters, which I'll start with, is in Virginia. So, Virginia, of course, can be understood with its proximity to Washington, D.C., and just Northern Virginia itself, like cities like Alexandria, again, Norfolk, like all these places are like the heart of the empire. This is where the imperial bureaucracy lives. This is how they operate, which is funny when you consider like there's a pretty big east-west divide in Virginia. Like when you're in Western Virginia, Southwestern Virginia, it feels like you're still like in West Virginia proper. It's very strange, just speaking from personal experience, having gone down there a few times myself. It's two completely different worlds. I mean, like you have DC on the one side, and driving through rural country roads, you have tar shacks up in the Appalachian Mountains. But again, just to paint that contrast. So, of course, you had Republican Glenn Youngkin going up against Democrat Terry McAuliffe, who is the former governor of Virginia. The way they do it is you can only serve one term at a time, but after taking a term off, you're eligible to run again. And of course, he was governor during the whole Charlottesville debacle, which the trial for that is going on right now, and we will cover that in a couple minutes here. And then Youngkin, who is just, at least theoretically, some run of the mill Republican, came from all the think tanks, came from, again, the typical Republican background. But the big issue that really won this over was particularly regarding the education system and to a lesser extent things like lockdowns and mandates and of course that ongoing battle. But I would say that was secondary to the education debate. Now, there were a couple things. The first one boils down to the so-called critical race theory thing, which pretty much the demoralization propaganda of American children pushed by American schools, for being honest. That's all it really boils down to. And the other big thing was the transgender rights issue with that incident in Loudoun County where there are allegations against a 15-year-old legally girl, but if we're being honest, boy, assaulting somebody in a girl's bathroom in just some school in Loudoun County. And again, these things all happened like a month and a half before the election because Virginia, since about 2008, 2012, with the way the election cycles have gone, has been understood to be a safely Democrat state. Like, for example, Obama won it twice, Hillary Clinton won it, and Trump lost it, Biden won it, even though there was some conspicuous vote counting last election. Of course, we'd never accuse anything where Trump was actually ahead most of the night in Virginia before it flipped. Now, make of that what you will. But the other interesting angle about Trump is, of course, Youngkin, like all Republicans, did run on the Trump platform. He did run as like, look, I got Donald's endorsement. That's why you should vote for me. And again, I don't know how much of you want to contribute to legitimate votes being cast versus maybe some more dubious things happening, but Youngkin actually did score higher than Trump in several rural areas. He did better with white women in general. He did better with a lot of demographics, but what really won him was that like rural conservative vote. Like he was up by several points where Trump simply was not. And you can go back to our episode after the past election from about a year ago. We get into that. Trump was in a no-win situation. He either appeals to his base and isolates everyone else, or he appeals to everyone else and isolates space. Where you, again, there's really no winning card. You're going to have to sacrifice one or the other. Now, of course, not being the president and actually haven't have held the office, Youngkin didn't have that problem. And again, I think it mainly came down to uh, a lot of it was also suburban votes on top of the rural votes. It came down to again the white soccer moms, like the kind of people who decide elections, if we're being honest. And when look now you can get them, and I think in the past several decades evident you can get them, the white suburbanite families to go along with a lot of stuff, but when you lack the tact or the optics, so to speak, of what the Democratic campaign was doing in Virginia, like for example, saying like, "Well, we're the teachers, we're the ones that control over the schools," pretty much again like insulting every like religiously attending PTA like soccer mom, again getting into that. It's like it's no wonder why you lost. You like went after the biggest single issue voters, and you just like said the one like if that comment wouldn't have been made, I think there's a very real possibility we could be talking about a blue Virginia again. And this also spilled over with the Virginia House of Delegates, which is their lower chamber of the legislature, also going back to narrow Republican control after having a healthy Democratic control. So I think the Democrats lost like 7 seats there. Virginia Senate, they have an election cycle on a different schedule. They took that back in 2019. So I mean, this is just returning to the trends of the past few decades. Virginia has always been a pretty red state, and a lot of that can be contributed to the military-industrial complex and, like, for example, Nova. A lot of the imperial elite who live in Virginia. Now, I think Virginia is particularly interesting when it comes to American elections, American politics, when you look at it as pretty much the seat of the empire that is co-equal, if not greater than DC. Because again, a lot of the DC bureaucrats they live there or they live on the other side in Maryland. Whereas again, Maryland's less of a gauge of that, but I think Virginia, particularly Northern Virginia, is a very interesting gauge in that watching how their political preferences flip from like Bush Senior and Bush Junior to again Obama and Hillary Clinton. I think that tells you all you need to know about the American empire and the people who are doing the nitty gritty work of running the day to day operations. But it looks like, of course, the Democrats, they did get the majority of the votes in most parts of Northern Virginia. Again, the individual like state legislature seats went more Democratic, and Youngkin's votes came more from the suburbs and the rural areas. Again, like this sort of the normal everyday people, a populist revolt, if you will. Again, I know. Now, how much his policies will actually reflect that, I don't know. I think that's relevant to the conversation we're trying to have here because what I see here, even if we assume he governs like your run of the mill uh, establishment GOP governor, tax cuts. We might do something about abortion before it gets struck down by the courts. Again, stuff like Republican governors usually do. I think the symbolism of his victory, much like Trump's, means much more than anything he may or may not do when he's actually in office.
Right, and I make this. There's several points I think, and you touched on the first one that I think is going to be kind of a theme for the show as far as domestic news goes, and that is the absolute hubris of the ruling party right now, of this regime. For him to dictate to parents that they have no control over the education of their children, particularly for a state that, like Virginia, let alone some other more blue states, is beyond the pale. And so this kind of regime hubris, we've seen a lot of it. We've seen um, in the higher levels of Biden's administration doing this, whether it's purporting that they're going to defend Taiwan or um, whatever it is, from the smaller domestic issues to the great game that is happening in geopolitics right now with the U.S. Most of the time, it's absolute hubris. With the exception of Milley, of all things, of all people, saying of all things that that we've moved into a multipolar world, and now there are three great powers, and those are America, China, and Russia. But yeah, I would say that this is a protest vote for sure. I don't have any faith that he's going to do much, but I think as you say, symbolically, this is important, not because nothing will happen, but because we've already seen what most of the progressives and the Dems are afraid of, that this is going to embolden people to take greater part in the school body and its politics in order to prevent something like CRT and trans kids' bathrooms and so on, running roughshod. And that's what they're ultimately afraid of. What he does or doesn't do, I think for most of the regime establishment, I think they know that there's not much to fear from him. However, what they are afraid of is that this will inspire like a grassroots thing, which is exactly what they were afraid of with Trump. It wasn't that they were, I mean, they pretended they were afraid that Trump would change everything. So they had to make it look like that in order to eschew the obvious, which was, on the ground politics, going, small and local and reaching outward from there from a genuine grassroots base.
Yeah,
That's what
stuff
they're
where
afraid of.
like individual actions actually hold some weight because you're not up against an international empire. Voting for president, voting for your senators. Well, I'm not gonna tell you what you should or shouldn't do with your life. You have
Yeah,
much less impact on what Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever your state senator or your district's congressman is than you do, for example, your local school board that you're 10 minutes down the road from and can actually attend their meetings and speak your mind because there's only a dozen people there. So
right.
again, and I think everyone at this point knows my opinions on democracy and elected government, but at this point, like in terms of actually using the apparatuses that exist effectively, it's going to be on the local level, and maybe if you get lucky on the state level. I think places like Florida and Texas, with their recent, just say, um, I wouldn't even call it rebellions because I know you had like the Texas abortion law, you have Florida completely eschewing all of these restrictions and giving the middle finger to the federal government. But again, this I would say unruliness from states like that.
Yeah.
You can get stuff like that, but insofar as politics in Washington is concerned, like I don't know why people even bother with it, which may sound ironic considering what we're doing with this show, but I digress on that point. But speaking of politics in Washington, speaking of all that and grassroots movement against the president, I think it's time we actually address a meme on the show. Now we do this every once in a while, but I would say this particular warrants it. Now I imagine anyone who's been online, especially in these circles for any amount of time, and it's funny. I actually just saw a guy. I was out in town wearing merch for this. He had like a shirt that just said "Let's go Brandon." Now, of course, I think you all know the origin of this at this point, but I'll just give a brief overview. So it's become very popular at sporting events or just like other like big public arenas, like where there's a lot of people. Where because of popular discontent with the way the country's being run, which is no surprise, you saw that. I mean, you've seen this with previous presidents, but I think because things have only gotten worse, it's become more obvious and has become even more commonplace. You have the chance of "fuck Joe Biden" have become popular. So of course the press tries to spin this. It's at some NASCAR race, like they're interviewing one of the drivers whose either first name or last name is Brandon, and like the reporter's like, "Oh no, they're saying let's go Brandon." So like it grew out of that. It became like pretty much code to say "fuck Joe Biden," and yeah, it's in the most literal definition of itself. It's a meme, and it's really caught on like with normal everyday people, like with a lot of boomers. I have to say, even I enjoy it. I think it. I don't know. I just think it shows the impotence of the regime right now. That this is all it takes to get to them. Now, I'm not saying this is going to lead to any great vision of a country or civilization that I would want, but I think just the fact that mocking what a journalist said to cover up for people who were, I wouldn't even call it protesting, but more so expressing dissatisfaction with the current president. I mean, I think that just is all it needs to about this regime, and we'll get into some of the even more ridiculous stories later with a couple of the high-profile trials going on in relation to stuff from the Trump era, that being Charlottesville and the Rittenhouse stuff. We'll get into that in a couple minutes, but you have all of this going on, like it's amazing that again, like I said, I don't think we're on the brink of collapse at this point. I think we're in pretty. I think the country is more or less impotent. I think the empire is more or less impotent. I'll put it that way. But it's just some. You just have to appreciate what one simple phrase, what one simple joke can balloon into. Where, of course, I know this doesn't really mean anything, but you have like elected Republican officials like congressmen, governors, senators, whatever, making this joke. And again, you have like high profile media figures making this joke. But again, it's just, like I said, it's amazing watching one simple joke balloon into this. Now, of course, with all things, there's a lot of grifting, but again, it's this isn't really something you can grift on unless you want to sell T-shirts. Which actually seeing that guy in that shirt made me want to because I think he said he custom ordered it. Because like the everyone I went in this place again. I live in a deep red area. For those of you who are shocked by that, everyone liked it. But I think he said he got it custom made. So if you want a new grift idea, that might be the thing to get on. Of course, I'm not giving any financial or business advice. I certainly won't get on that grift myself. I certainly won't sell those shirts to you people. But again, with all that aside the point, um, I think when something like that can proliferate to the degree it does, now of course that is thanks to modern communications, internet, etc. But the fact that something that just seems very simple. I mean, and you had the fuck Trump stuff like for the past 4 years. That wasn't a surprise. That wasn't a surprise from
Yeah,
the kind of people like. But maybe it's confirmation bias. Maybe it's just
it's
the
different
lens.
when we do
Yeah,
it.
yeah. But maybe it's just the lens I'm looking through. But even like with that, like number one, that just seemed hysterical. That just seems shrieking. This seems funnier. This seems higher energy, and this also seems more popular. Like I think,
Yeah.
regardless of what a polarizing figure that Trump was, at the end of the day, most of the American population being apolitical, they simply did not care what Trump did. Now, maybe, and you can make the argument, again, I'm no economist, maybe this inflation, maybe this whole economic dire straits we're in is a result of Trump's policy, is a result of the money printing, of the, cutting taxes for whoever. Maybe that's the case. Again, I genuinely don't know. I'm not an economist. But right now, Joe Biden is in office and he's presiding, as president over this current economic crisis. And, that's something that if you don't turn on the news, if you stay away from the political side of social media, you still notice because you have to go to the grocery store like everyone else. You notice that, beef prices are up. You notice that, the big debate now is the gallon of milk. Oh, why do you need so much milk? Like, it's not like a vital part of the, you know,
Mhm.
human and particularly the Western diet for the past how many millennia? Gee, I don't know. But, like with that, like, it's things where, like, even if you're apolitical, like they start to affect your bottom line, and quite literally, that it starts to burn a hole in your wallet when when prices for whatever are up. We showed a few months ago the price of lumber like ballooning up exponentially, but again, at the end of the day, it's just one simple joke that honestly, this ruffles them the most I've seen since just about anything. Like I
Yeah.
know like this isn't like a new thing. They got mad at like the Pepe stuff in 2016. They got mad at I think the Clown World stuff like in 2018. But again, there's these times where like these like right wing or these conservative memes will get some degree of popularity. And of course, they'll spend the next weeks talking about their hate symbols or terrible or you shouldn't do it. But well, number one, it hasn't gotten that treatment, I should say, yet. And number two, it seems like it's taken on even more popularity than a lot of these other previous, like, meme epidemics, so to speak, that the right wing has had over the past 4 or 5 years.
Right. And there's something about this meme, whether it's like, as you mentioned, Pepe, because he's so smug. Pepe was even more smug than them, and he won. So, that troubled them. The NPC man, I think, cut right to their heart. That was truly hilarious, and it was very sophisticated, and they knew it. The other was, the rash of posters that people put up saying it's okay to be white. That I think uh, just undercut everything that they were doing. It exposed them and their intentions, and it took a while for them to come up with a response that was cogent and a reasonable, rational argument, which was never really provided. So all they did was double down on, mobile white supremacy, and this is just another dog whistle for white supremacy. So I mean, all of the Virginia election, and as you say, the ongoing trials, whether it's Rittenhouse or Charlottesville or January 6th, all of them point to the same thing, that the system is unwilling to hear even. Uh, I mean, all you have to do is look at the way mainstream media dealt with their loss and it is their loss in Virginia. The immediate referral to racism and so on. So yeah, let's go, Brandon. The only thing I've seen is, why are you censoring yourself? Because obviously it, because it was funnier when the media was lying than to just say fuck Joe Biden. I mean, definitely fuck Joe Biden, but that's what it comes down
Yeah, I
to,
mean, it's taken on
right?
of life its own beyond that. Like, you could argue at
Yeah,
first it was to undermine that message, but again, like, at the end of the day, it actually not only took that message but amplified it. Which, like, again, like I've seen people who think it's like the funniest thing ever. I don't think it's like in terms of just the right wing autism. I think we've all been entrenched in the past 5 years or whatever. It's certainly not the most impressive one I've seen, but like
yeah,
in
definitely.
terms of its reach, in terms of its effectiveness, in terms of its effect on the public consciousness, in all of
Yeah.
those, it's one of the more impressive ones.
It is, because it's a criticism again of the media. And I think that's why the media is most upset by it, because it's when the media was caught lying again, right? And this is actually we're a really interesting impasse, right? Um, on the one hand, we have, especially after the fall of Afghanistan, we have a 20, some would argue a 30-year history of unquestioned American hegemony, and the best and brightest of American leadership seeming to not be able to know what to do next, right? Even Biden said that they're no longer going to go on a military footing, but will try other methods. So, what is this impasse? Well, this impasse is they spent, the last 20 years making sure that all the voices that were cautionary voices, right, that they deemed lacked confidence, were shut out, right? And Afghanistan is a prime example of this. There are other examples, domestic and foreign as well. However, now they're at a stage where it's not just, we only want people who have confidence in the regime. We cannot tolerate criticism of the regime. And it's an uncomfortable position, because the more they argue about it, particularly, the janissaries of the regime, the plebs that see the Democrat Party as the party of the good, more or less, uh, they what are they going to do to stop this? Because the more they argue for it, the more they have to accept that they are in power. That and that's I mean, that has proven to be an uncomfortable position for them. They've always needed that, the idea that America is run by secret Nazis, the paperclip trail, and von Braun, and like the most ludicrous ideas, when we know the one or two major players pushing American politics and culture. And so um, I think that's what's interesting, is this impasse where for years they've spent, like, not tolerating any kind of um, questioning or lack of confidence, and now they're showing themselves to be quite fragile.
Yeah, and I think another
Um,
thing that plays into that is you've noticed this over the past few years, and I think it's really ramped up this year, which I think shows more fragility. Where, of course, if you were a dissident, if you spoke out in any real capacity against this, you were shut up, whether that was through private means or public means. And again, we can get into some of those examples at some other time. But what it's evolved into now, what I've noticed is if you say something that isn't a positive affirmation, if you say something that's apolitical or don't comment at all, you're immediately, a dissident. You're somebody who's suspect, whose
Yeah.
loyalty is called into question because you could say nothing and your silence implicates you because you're not, positively affirming the regime or the current president or whatever. And it's grown into that. It's grown to like, well, yes, well, surely you approve of what you're doing, of what we're doing. Surely you think that we're doing a good job. Surely you support X, Y, and Z. Surely you want to say Black Lives Matter. Surely you want to say, wear your mask or again, whatever of these numerous slogans they've trotted out over the past 5 years at this point. But again, you bring up a good point about fragility, and with that, moving on to the couple of trials going on this week. I know you were more keyed in on the Charlottesville one, so I'll leave that one to you, and I'll take the Rittenhouse one after you get done with this. But do continue.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's been nothing less than entertaining. The trial currently taking place in Charlottesville. Basically, what they want to establish is that the Unite the Right rally intentionally went to Charlottesville in order to foment violence and present a danger to the public there, which, of course, wasn't the case. And it's entertaining because Cantwell, I believe he's representing himself. Today he was reading passages out of he was quoting passages from Mein Kampf about how Mustache Man did not want to take over the government in a violent way, and he wrote it after the 1923 push and while he was in jail and so on and so on. And like from what I'm reading on Telegram from some of the accounts that are following this very closely, it sounds hilarious. I mean, on opening day, he was asking people to follow him on his social media accounts. But he seems quite confident. And so Spencer was also being questioned, but apparently it did not look too good. He answered everything with correct, correct, correct. And this is a pretty powerful, let's say, law firm. It's headed by Kaplan. Kaplan is, well, I mean, let's just say they're all a part of the same ethnic group. And the argument that they're using is this was exactly like a preamble to 1930s Germany and all these jokes are merely the beginning of a horrible tragedy and so on. But so far the case, like Cantwell does not seem phased by any of this, and that could be because he might even be in many ways like a bigger Spurg than even Spencer. They're going after Spencer basically. They're trying to get him to trip up. He hasn't made any serious mistakes, but basically on his egotism and arrogance. But from what I've seen, he has not tripped up yet. And in fact, things are going so poorly for the prosecution that you notice mainstream media is not covering this.
Yeah, and that's
Yes,
also in the
the
lens
alt-right's not
of
covering it either.
this
The
also
alt-right's not.
in the lens of this was the thing that was like the big foundational myth. This is what kickstarted Joe Biden's campaign when I saw in Charlottesville, I knew that somebody had to stand up and bring this country together. I'm sure you all remember that speech that
Yeah, yeah,
Biden gave
good point.
announcing his candidacy. But point being is this is something they harped on for several years, pretty much up until the
Yes.
last election. And up until the last debate, are you going to tell the poor boys to stand down and like,
The
like,
poor
yeah,
boys.
yeah, that's
Yeah, I remember
that's
that.
another Bidenism that's long forgotten. But but with that being said, with that being said, again, you had this thing that was
So
supposed to be
good.
this new foundational myth, this like rise of American fascism or whatever they want to term it, and it's
Yeah.
such a clown show that the media doesn't even want to touch it because as ridiculous as any of these figures that may have acted at the time or during this trial, who looks like the even bigger fool? The American legal system right now. Like the fact that any of this is happening,
Yes.
again, and we'll get into some of the J6 stuff and some of the Rittenhouse stuff that will just bolster this point. But the fact that, again, they don't even want to touch this shows you how much they actually think of their own foundational myth that they've been trying to create for the past several years.
Right. And I should mention that Moon, the judge on the trial for this Charlottesville trial, uh, has been quite fair. Uh, he has supported Cantwell on many instances, and Cantwell's his instincts seem to be quite good. And of course, they're hoping that some of his strange charm will also rub off on the jury. I say strange not to really belittle him. I mean, he is kind of like an odd guy. Like, I remember even like listening and watching his podcast long before Charlottesville. Uh, I'm just saying, like, for the average normie out there, he's strange, right? Like, I hope people understand that. We're not. I'm not talking about people in the dissident, right? I mean, we know him, and anyhow, I don't want to belabor the point, but all to say, it's going quite well, and I don't know what the outcome will be, but if let's say even if they win, um, this this will eventually become like another instance of where the regime has failed, right? Trust will erode. Now, I think the the ground zero of the total erosion, and now we're living in the fallout, happened last year during the George Floyd riots. I think when we saw that CNN reporter with mayhem in the background, fire, one of the businesses on fire, saying this was a mostly peaceful protest. I think at that moment, most Americans saw, right, who were honest with themselves, that they were being lied to. That in a sense, this had become Pravda news in the 80s. And the confidence isn't there. The country is not confident about the future. Now, I think it is inevitable that America will balkanize before the end of this century, easily. Uh, because living together is becoming more and more impossible. And as it so happens, every time that you know the opposing party becomes president, those opposed to him already feel like they're living under a regime. Something that Nick Land, I remember, tweeted a couple of years ago. It was such an astute statement.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's only going to get
so
worse
so
as material conditions continue to deteriorate
yes,
because so far people have been able to stay fat, happy, and sedated. They have their McDonald's, they have their Netflix. They have access to that, so while they may not like whatever's happening in DC, they don't care because life is either too good or just good enough to actually do something about it. But as that, and as
yes.
we're seeing, I think, with the current state of the economy, continues to decline, a lot of those illusions are going to go away when the comfortable lifestyle, you know, just gets less and less comfortable. And I think,
Yes,
especially with
and
a
it's
lot of the climate change agenda stuff, like how much restrictions they push on that and how that affects the standard of living in this country and in the Western world, that'll also be another really big factor in all of this. But it's all of these things put together. Again, I'm not saying Americans are going to take to arms. Frankly, I don't think they have the stomach to do it. I'm also going to say I somewhat agree with your balkanization take, but I, I, I would describe it as more like an extreme federalization where nobody's going to have the will or the guts or the stomach to actually fracture the country, but the way it operates is effectively, two or more separate countries, like where we may be under the same polity, but it's in name only.
right. It could be even like Iraq, which has like a de facto Kurdistan within it, and has separate regions that where one group has far more power and sway over the other, and the other groups know not to go there, and so on. I mean, in effect, that's already happening. But I should say just one or two more things about the trial in Charlottesville. is that they're going to try to establish their objective is to establish that Unite the Right went there simply to cause violence. They're not doing a very good job of proving that at all. And if this ends in a mistrial, it's going to be devastating for the regime. This will be very, very bad. Now, they've wanted to cripple anyone in the Unite the Right that they could. Whatever you think of them, uh, like their downfall will also make other dissidents within the West, uh, feel the pain, as it were, as well.
Yeah, despite
So
all the ego wars and the distant right or the online right or whatever the hell you want to call it, and again, I'm not like endorsing or condemning any of these people. I don't have much loyalty insofar as that's concerned.
yeah,
Insofar as the
same.
people in the courts or whatever are concerned, there is no distinction between like a Whignat or like your regular nationalist or
Yeah,
like I'm a traditionalist. Again, like all of that,
they literally don't care about that.
no matter what label you ascribe yourself to, is you're a right wing extremist and a terrorist, and you must be dealt with. Now, it hasn't gotten quite that far yet. I say we're on the precipice of something like that, but
Yeah.
they don't care about the fact that you agree on 95% of the stuff, which is anti-regime, but you disagree over a matter of personality or optics or any of these like just minor squabbles that constantly go on in these sort of spheres that I at least like to think that we try to stay out of, and I hope you guys appreciate that, and I hope you guys can see that.
Yeah.
Just again, I way too much energy, and this is somebody who does the show as autistic as this. Okay, so but with my personal rants aside, again, insofar as the regime is concerned, there is no distinction between these dissidents. You are all dissidents. You are all people who are disloyal, and depending on your sway or whatever, you may be deemed a threat for that reason. And again, you could say like, especially, and we'll get into some of this, like the January 6th people certainly don't have much overlap insofar as our point of view is concerned. Like insofar as like the internal right wing debates are like, because like January 6th was like pro-Trump people, QAnon people, whereas you have like a lot of these Charlottesville people, they've denounced Trump. They said, oh, he was a traitor, oh, he's outlived his usefulness, or like, oh, he's done all he can for us. Or again, so it's interesting because like you have these things that seem to be, at least from our point of view, these very fierce debates. But insofar as the other side is concerned, it's like we don't care. You're all anti us, so we don't care whatever your internal disputes are. And again, I'm not calling for some sort of grand right wing unity. I'm not calling for anything like that. Do whatever the hell you want. But again, I'm just trying to make the point that the regime isn't going to spare you because you come up with a
Yeah.
funny name for your ideology that distances you from person X, Y, or Z.
Or actually, I don't actually like so and so or so and so.
Yeah,
They literally don't care. It doesn't matter, and it's not just them; it's their Jannies as well. So, yeah, makes no difference. But yeah, that's all I have so far for the Charlottesville proceedings that are going on now. But I'm sure we'll return to it next week. This is definitely something to watch because it is part of this erosion, definitely. And I guess when we get into January the 6th, that's an even bigger example in many
yeah.
ways.
And then I would say right in between this two is what I'm going to get into right now, which is Kyle Rittenhouse, who of course was the 17-year-old, now 18-year-old at the time, who was caught in the, of course, fight that ended in shooting three people during the riots over the summer of 2020. I think he was actually involved in the Jacob Blake riots. I think that's was why he was in Kenosha. Now, of course, he's originally from Illinois, but like from Chicago to Kenosha, it's like come on, it's like less than an hour away. I think I don't think it's considered a suburb, but again, it's close enough to the point where like if it's not a cross country trip is what I'm getting at. Oh, and the rifle he didn't even have wasn't across state lines or anything like that. And the people he shot in this riot were, um, again, let's just say all three white passing, two of them of a certain tribe. One of them was a convicted sex offender. The other one, I'm pretty sure, was a convicted domestic abuser.
Spousal abuse.
Yeah, so like again,
Yeah.
like these real upstanding people, like these real credit societies. Two of them were fatal. One of them survived it because he was just hit in the arm. Now, of course, he's crippled for life because of that. I mean, I suppose that's what happens when you attack someone. They you attack somebody armed with a rifle and they defend themselves. So again, that became this whole thing about this 17-year-old kid. Like, oh, he went here to do that, and now the details could be fuzzy, but I do believe the circumstance what brought him there is like he was actually related to the people at the gas station he was at. I think it was like his uncle's gas station or some relative's gas station. In which case, he was there again. Maybe you could say he was foolish, naive. Maybe you could say he was a dumb 17-year-old kid. He wanted to clean up the graffiti and like push back against this kind of stuff. And then at least he did have the wisdom to realize, yeah, I'm putting myself in physical danger. I should probably take some measure to protect myself. And honestly, he may be severely beaten or hell. I mean, I think the one other guy again, you can see the pictures. He has the handgun. I mean, Rittenhouse could be dead himself had he not acted the way that he did. But of course, this became a big thing. He was a right wing, far right terrorist. And again, not that these people make the distinction, but like he's this pudgy, like half Hispanic kid. Like, and you look at the pictures, it's funny how much actually some of the pictures they take of him try to make him look more white than he is. It's almost like a Zimmerman thing all over again. And again, so in the court, you have like the prosecution. If you didn't know any better, you would think the prosecution was the defense with how poor of a job they're doing. And frankly, this is because of whatever district attorney wants to make their name prosecuting this case, the one who put away Kyle Rittenhouse. But again, this seems to be blowing up in their face because as much as Rittenhouse is a dissident by all means, it, because of the way the court system still functions, there's not enough empirical evidence. There's not even enough evidence that they can forge to try to make it look like he was the guilty party. And that's what it seems to be going like so far. I think this one will probably hold much more sway than the Charlottesville case because it is of much more recent memory, especially with the 2020 election and the whole Black Lives Matter thing. And again, you already hear reports of people trying to like dox the jurors, which happened with one of the other high profile trials. Oh yeah, Chauvin is where what happened with that, where New York Times
Yeah.
ran that piece, and again, that's all within the same vein of each other within the same summer. In fact, it was actually the incident that sparked this all. But with all of that happening, as much as I think they'd like to throw this kid away for the majority of his life, I simply don't think they have the means to. I simply don't think that as much as they want to, just it's beyond their capability.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, their star witness for the state literally confirmed everything that the defendant lawyer was saying, that Rosenbaum, who, according to one journalist, was practicing Judaism that night, um, um, said that if I catch you alone tonight, I'm going to kill you. And so it has completely blown up in their face. Again, um, if they, I mean, Rittenhouse can go, can he is being charged, of course, for illegally having a weapon, but the bigger case of him as a murderer of these people, when there's ample evidence that they came after him and that he spent his entire time trying to run away from them, after the first confrontation with Rosenbaum, uh, doesn't hold water. And because you're going to have to make the case that here's this murderer, but what, everybody's pursuing him. Um, Also, it should be mentioned that gunshots were first fired by someone else adjacent to that parking lot where Rosenbaum was shot. Um, Forget the name of the New York Times reporter. He has a Scandinavian name. It might have been Christensen, something like that. And he was the first one to actually break that, to reveal that evidence. And it should be noted that, of course, now we've seen drone footage. And, every protest, probably for the last 5, 6, 7 years, maybe longer, The authorities have drone footage of all of these protests. So if they're not showing it to you, there's the reason is usually that it won't make the regime look good for them to show it. So yeah, that's my input on the proceedings with Rittenhouse so far.
Oh, certainly. And again, that's another thing we'll probably have to touch on in the next week and several weeks to come as that plays out. And I think in terms of public backlash, that one has a lot more at stake because, again, Charlottesville is more or less, as much as they tried to make it this foundational myth, has faded from the public consciousness. Nobody really cares about it anymore beyond a small handful of people. And of course, well, one thing I forgot to mention with the Virginia election, they tried to psyop it where, these people got outed as Democratic Party operatives who were doing the tiki torch thing at one of Youngkin's
Yeah.
campaign rallies. But again, by and large, most people just don't care about that anymore. Whereas this one, again, is much fresher in the American mind. And something that's even fresher in the American mind than that is just some of like the absurd conditions that the people detained on J6 are being kept under. Now, like if you want to be honest, like yeah, okay, trespassing on federal property, this is usually something that warrants you a hefty fine or some similar degree of punishment. But like, what if the people who are there who've gotten released or whatever are to be believed? Again, these sound like Guantanamo Bay type conditions, like, and frankly even worse in some cases. I'm
Yeah.
certainly no defender of our policy in Gitmo, but again, like you had these people who are mostly like dumb, like okay, maybe dumb isn't the right word, but more so like naive Trump boomers that they think their political activism can make a difference, at least in that sense. That
Yeah.
they think that they can convince Mike Pence in the Senate at the last second to say like, "Oh no, here's actual proof, and here's why the Electoral College and the Congress choose Trump instead." Like, so maybe stupidity, maybe naivete, maybe a little bit of both, whatever. But point being is these people who ultimately were hopped up on, frankly, I'd say suicidal optimism.
Copium.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
copium, hopium, whatever you want to call it, did this thing and, well, let's be honest, ruined their lives. And I mean, this is another thing that they haven't been able to push to the degree that they've nearly wanted to because then again, they're trying to say, like, this is another 9/11 or even worse in some cases. They almost overthrew the United States government. They were baying for blood. They were looking for representatives and senators and congressmen or whatever, and they were out to do violence. Again, all that nonsense. But again, when it comes to it, when you see the footage, and again, the only casualty that day is an officer discharging a weapon on a protester, and again, touching back on that Babbitt case, but with everything you see with that, again, these people are being kept in pretty gruesome conditions, like solitary, being denied visitors, in some cases denied bail or put with this absurdly high bail. But you still do see this interesting footage that comes out, and maybe this plays into that naivete angle where I'm talking about, where like they'll have these very what are considered traditionally patriotic displays with the Pledge of Allegiance or national anthem. Now, maybe in my personal opinion, at this point, they should be singing Dixie inside their cells, but I digress. But again, like they still have so much faith in this nation that, if we're being honest, has betrayed them because again, and this isn't even me reverting back to libertarianism or constitutionalism, but you have this country that more or less makes this promise to you: you're guaranteed these certain rights, whatever's in the Constitution, and you still have this people, mainly from this again boomer or older Gen X generation, that still genuinely believe that promise is valid. That, oh, you do have the freedom to assemble and speak your mind. You do have the freedom to bear your arms or whatever. And even after all of that, it is again both admirable, and you also can't help but think like like hopium copium when you see these displays out of them. But again, this is getting to the point where like it's like the way these people are treated harsher than, again, the people who rioted in D.C. when Trump got elected or Trump got inaugurated, so to speak. The people who again had the outburst after Trump got elected, the last summer of Antifa and Black Lives Matter. But again, these, of course, I don't think we need to clarify to any of you, but just in general, these are all regime approved movements. And that's
Yes.
really what it boils down to. This last one that showed,
Eh,
again, minor discontent, and again, going back to the fact that, if you're not positively affirming the regime, you're an enemy. The fact that they said,
Yep.
hey, there's something conspicuous here. We want to talk to, our congressman, or we want to, stage a demonstration, say you need to, do a more thorough job doing X, Y, or Z. Again, that gets you treated as enemies of the state. You were plotting a coup. Again, this is the beer hall push. This is like, one of these people is going to write, my struggle in prison, whatever. And I can't believe Trump is behind this. Is Trump's movement to try to seize back power, or whatever. Again, even though, I mean, at that point, even the speech Trump gave that day, I remember, Trump just seemed like a very defeated man even before that. And then the fact that everything that
Yes.
happened after that, him getting kicked off of pretty much the entirety of the internet, or 90% of it, for being honest,
Yeah.
any of the important sites, especially Twitter. I, he just seemed like a very defeated man. Now, maybe you could say he, again, getting the conspiracies that he lured his supporters in there, he sold them out for his own safety, his own freedom, whatever. I don't know if that's true. I don't have enough information to even begin to speculate on something like that. But again, you have these people who are, again, being treated like terrorists over somebody who, at the end of the day, threw them under the bus, and are still fiercely loyal, maybe not to a regime, but to a nation that propagates a regime that treats them like this. And again, this, more so than the other two cases, this to me exemplifies the absolute rot of the American empire, that any of this is happening in the first place. Like, and you want to make comparisons to other similar, like, strong anti-government protesters. Like, I know Macedonia isn't America. Is my, no, not to offend you personally or anything, but like, you had in 2016 where they burnt down the president's office over a wiretapping scandal. And again, you didn't hear about anything like this. And again, a lot of these things, like, they'll usually rally up and, dish out some punishment to the organizers of these things and grant a general amnesty to, like, the foot soldiers, so to speak. Again, you had this happen in several state capitals. Throughout the decades in America, you had, like, union workers storming the Wisconsin legislature during one of their hearings regarding workers' rights. You had in Columbus, Ohio, during the Black Lives Matter thing, you had protesters trying to breach that. Again, these things aren't unheard of. People breaking into legislative houses, not only in this country but across the world. On our Storm in a Teacup episode, we actually had several examples of where this kind of stuff has happened. And again, most of these are written off for what they are. Just pretty pathetic lash outs, or just dumb protests. And most people are given a slap on the wrist or just let go completely and just saying, just stay out of here. But again, I think it goes back to that theme of fragility of the regime, that they need this level of crackdown on everything.
Right, and I think it's also, I mean, it's very important to, I think, understand the subtext of what it is that the regime is doing. In that, by them overblowing what had happened that day, is a way to reduce tolerance for what they think is a foreshadow of things to come. Now, I tend to agree that January the 6th is actually a foreshadow of things to come. Maybe there won't be another storming of the Capitol, right? Like, I'm not suggesting, like the Charlottesville lawyers, that this was a practice run for something else, or CNN suggesting that it was a practice run. There wasn't anything so premeditated as that. Um, the authorities did think, of course, as we've said on this show many times, that, let's say, maybe allowing this gay op to happen is in some ways beneficial because then they can demonize them. But the struggle for the regime, particularly for its news media arm, has been to try to convince Americans that they came within a hair's breadth of Trump being dictator for life in America. And the vast majority of Americans don't believe that at all. They might argue that, but they don't believe that. and those are two separate things. However, I do think they fear that, especially considering the way those politicians cowered, I think they actually are afraid. I think they do think that this is possibly a foreshadowing of things to come. Because let's be honest, in the next 10 years, do you see America being more unified or less unified?
Well, certainly
There
will
is,
band around the common thread, China, right? That's really going to unify us. Certainly.
yeah, yeah. And they know this, right? They know this. So they want to build up a certain level of intolerance, and they have to overstate it. Now, at the same time, it makes them look like liars, which erodes trust. But the reason they're doing this is because they are actually planning for the future.
Yes, and the last thing I will touch on, just in this same vein, before we get into some of our other big news for this week, is that the mandates for you know what have been pushed back to January 4th. Now, there are some good things to take away from this. There's also concerning things to take away from this. So, they actually do have a solid plan in the works now where they pretty much announced that any company over 100 employees has to have these mandates as part of OSHA regulations, or else they're going to be fined so much for whatever, and willful violations equal whatever degree of fine. And of course, they wanted to do this several months ago. They've wanted to do this for months, and already you're seeing legal challenges pushed to it, which suppose shows that there is far from uniformity in the regime where there's actually pushbacks against this. And I'll get into this stuff in a little, just in a second here, where they've set the deadline for January 4th, and there's pretty substantial reason to believe that because a lot of businesses have been kicking cans down the road. I mean, they're already having people having a hard time people getting to work as it is, and just putting another restriction on that makes it all the more difficult with that in particular. But I don't know who knows. Come January 4th, it could be that we actually meant March 4th, and yeah, it could be one of those things that they keep kicking the can on the road, both because they don't really have the means to implement it at that point, and it's also something they just want to have hovering above you the whole time, something that they can constantly threaten you with, like, oh, we're going to implement this and whatever deadline, and again, just pretty much a terror tactic. Now, again, I can't speak whether these things will actually come into full effect on the set deadline, but again, I'm speculating it's going to be this terror tactic sort of thing. It's not going to be a bargaining chip they just give up like that because they can weigh it over the head of the average American. They could weigh it over the head of even the business class at that point, and say, well, gee, it'd be a shame if we actually went through with this. And already you're seeing Pfizer, and you saw it was one of the British companies
Mhm.
announced that, like, oh, look, we have a pill treatment for this, as well as the what. So, like, even like the most trusted and reliable pharmaceutical companies that we're supposed to put our fate in the hands of are already saying, like, oh yeah, look at this alternative measure of treating this worst disease since the Spanish flu. And one could say that could be a breaking in the narrative where, again, I would hazard a guess that the regime is still debating what they really want to do with this themselves, like how much more they think they can, how much more juice they think they can squeeze out of this crisis in particular, and what particular extractions they can make from both the American people and even some elements of the business class in this. So I would say that certainly keep your eye out for what's going to happen in the next few months. But like, it seems like this threat that's also just not empty, but is on very shaky ground, like something that, even though they've set a deadline, even though they put out all these things that they want to do with it, seems like they don't really have the means to enforce quite yet. Now, again, maybe sometime later in 2022 we could be having a different conversation, but I don't see, it's from the initial Biden announcement. I believe that was back in it was either in beginning of September or like late September. He announced that, like, again, it's been about 2 months, and I don't see, especially with the number of legal challenges from whatever groups or from state and local governments or whoever, I think and I think the regime probably knows this on some level, that the idea that this will be a federal OSHA policy in less than 2 months from now seems a bit absurd to me. Maybe I'm being far too optimistic about this, but again, it just seems like another like arbitrary date they want to throw out there, so then they can push it back another 2 3 months. When they realize, oh, we're not ready to implement this. Now, I think they would love to implement this. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that
Yeah.
oh, it's just a threat. I think they'd love to do it if they could, but I think it's going to be one of those things where they have to be sure that they can actually effectively do it, which is going to lead to a long and arduous journey. Which is why I said when these things were first speculated and first announced that, yeah, okay, of course they want this to happen, but I suppose at that point it's really a race against time on both sides. Can they find some way to implement this fast enough and effective enough before the entire narrative just completely caves in on itself, even so far as the establishment is concerned? I think that's the real question.
Right. And as we were saying off air, is this a drip, of opium that they're providing for us, or is this a real pushback? Now, my feeling was that it was more of a drip, right? However, now that you're talking, several things have happened, and one of them is that I've noticed that here in Canada, there's been a shift. It was expected that nurses in Quebec and Ontario would all have to be vaccinated or else they lose their jobs. So far, I think yesterday or the day before, the Quebec government has found an accord with nurses that are not taking the jab, and there might be a turn right now. I don't know whether they are exaggerating the amount of people who have been fully vaccinated. I don't know. I don't know if it's now because they have approved of vaccinations. I mean, they've been approved in the US, and they'll be approved eventually here too.
Well, I
For
think I
children
think another
5
angle
to
to consider.
11, I think they feel like victory is theirs now, because the demographic they were worried most about, um, you know, um, inculcating, yes, inculcating. And this was the last group I think that they were concerned with. Um, I don't know exactly. I think time will tell uh, whether this is a drip or not. There does seem to be some pushback, but they have their own level of tolerance. Mm, it's uh, it's a difficult thing to say. I do think that they were looking for getting children vaccinated between 5 and 11, and then that would clear the way for the next few generations, that all the next generations will be fully vaccinated. And if there's some spotty areas amongst Gen Xers and millennials who are not vaccinated, and the odd boomer, then so be it. I think that plays a role. What I'm concerned about is, in this January the 4th rollback, is that now they want to target small businesses with 100 or less employees. They want them to pay heavy fines if they don't comply. That, in a way, scares me more. And the reason for that is, just like um, with the lockdowns themselves last year, and I should mention the 3.5 months of nonstop rioting. Obviously, these measures are to intimidate um, small business owners, slightly, small to medium-sized business owners. They don't want people to have that kind of financial independence, because that presents a threat to the regime.
Oh, certainly, and that's another thing they can use to drive it out. And again, they also did this. You want to go that far back with Obamacare? One of the big things was the mandates on employer provide health insurance. Now, again, while I think theoretically that's a good idea, just though it was one of those things, the way they rolled out was to target small businesses and target that degree of financial
Yes.
independence. And the last thing I'll say about this, because we still have quite a bit more
Yeah.
I want to get into, just a couple things about a few things about Russia and the Middle East we'll get into in a couple minutes here, but it also is interesting insofar as the American mandates are concerned because they haven't really given a definitive stance on, well, what do remote work employees have to do, and we're also going to allow you to do testing once a week, or there also are avenues open for if you want to appeal for some sort of like exemption, for example, a religious or ethical exemption. So it seems like they know they can't implement this fully. They know they can implement it to quite a degree that would actually do them quite a bit of good. But again, there's still, even from the regime, seems to be this lack of confidence to a degree when it comes to those issues. And I think these next couple months, not that I, of course, advocate you do anything personally, again, that you make your own decisions with your life, take whatever into consideration. We have a couple months of wiggle room, and I don't know, we could see what we saw again, where, by January 4th, there wasn't enough pressure applied, so they have to delay this deadline yet again because, again, they rolled this out and they never gave a definitive deadline. But with all that being said, I suppose it's all just really up in the air right now, and there's not much more you can say about it beyond
Hmm.
that. And with that moving on, I suppose we should get into some Middle Eastern news with Russia and Belarus. Now, it seems like they have taken some major steps towards the Union
Yeah.
Treaty, and a lot of that had to do with standardization of military and economy in particular, is what you were telling me about. So I'll let you take the reins from here.
Right. So there are 28 points of integration that Russia and Belarus are working on at the moment. And as you mentioned, one of them is for military cooperation. Um, this is huge. The countries were already well meshed, as I've mentioned many times on the show before, especially when I've traveled. If you're traveling to Russia, you will see booths that are strictly for Russia and Belarus. And then there's everybody else. Sometimes it's everybody else from the EU and everybody else outside of the EU, but Russia and Belarus go here. And then there can be subdivisions after that. But so that is to say that they're very well enmeshed with one another, but they're going to get a lot more enmeshed. I think we are witnessing Belarus well on the way to becoming another federation state within Russia itself. It might have more autonomy than, say, Yakutia, for instance, or Kamchatka or whatever, but it's going to be more firmly brought into Russia proper. This is, of course, going to strike as it already has, strike the ire of the Americans and the collective West, particularly Lithuania and Poland. Because in a way, Russia is sort of playing the same game that the Americans are. If the Americans are going to push NATO all the way to the southern flank of the Russians along the Black Sea vis-a-vis Ukraine, then the Russians are going to push in the opposite direction to the north of that toward Western Europe, vis-a-vis Belarus against Poland and Lithuania, closer to the Baltic Sea. So um, this might also indicate, it might be indicative of the kind of things that are happening in Ukraine now, meaning I think that Ukraine itself is playing a role in this integration process. That is, if Ukraine had gone better, we might not have seen this process. But violence has escalated further still from the last show that we did about Ukraine. Uh, Another Ukrainian soldier was killed and another one was wounded. But I think also importantly, the DPR, as opposed to the LNR, which is the Lugansk region, um, rather the Donetsk. It's in the Donetsk area that most of this fighting is taking place. They have admitted to over a dozen deaths of their soldiers. Some of them are from illness, but some of them are definitely from the attacks from the Ukrainians that have been going on almost on a daily basis from last week. We talked about that one artillery piece that was knocked down, but there has been an vehicle, armored personnel vehicle that was taken out as well. So things are escalating there. Um, Now they haven't broke in a way that we saw back in April, but this could be Zelensky not so much doing the bidding of the Americans, but getting the Americans to react, getting the Americans to get on his side. And of course, it's to save his political hide,
Yeah, that's also
because he has become wildly unpopular in Ukraine.
yes, and as you were saying, with last week, with the previous few weeks, due to the embarrassments Ukraine had, of course, there had to be a response. They had to reassert themselves,
Yeah.
especially Zelensky had to reinsert himself as head of state of Ukraine, showing that, yes, I'm competent, yes, I'm capable of running this country. And I do think, again, not only this particular situation, but the entirety of the Ukraine debacle over the past 7, 8 years goes to show with what we saw in Russia with Belarus that while Lukashenko may have had more positive feelings towards the West or tried to walk on that balance beam, especially after the 2020 color revolution, it's been showed that there is no balance beam to be walked on. There is no parlaying with the West, and that
Mhm.
really it's either we become another Ukraine or we grow even closer to Russia to the point of implementing a lot of the points laid out in the Union State Treaty. And even from the diplomatic channels of the United States, whether that be the State Department, Blinken himself, any of these people, you haven't had too strong of words or even any words said about this. Where has this happened in 2018, 2019, or even 2020? Now I know that was under Pompeo and Trump, but if this would have happened, I think at any point after either Georgia or the Maidan, it would have been wall to wall coverage about how Russia's annexing another country, how Russia is expanding its borders. But there is, insofar as Western media is concerned, no coverage on what is happening with Belarus, what is happening with this integration process, because yet again, I think much like a lot of the internal disputes within the empire, this is something that also looks very embarrassing. Two former Soviet republics on the path to unification. Not only that, but Russia and Belarus on the path to unification. After they tried this whole thing in Ukraine, after they tried Georgia, after they have the Baltic states firmly within their sphere, and whatever games they're trying in Central Asia right now, post Afghanistan or even pre Afghanistan, it just looks embarrassing that Russia, which was projected to collapse so many times over the past 20 years, in fact is not already expanded its borders once with Crimea, but is expanding its borders again with a possible full integration of Belarus.
Right, right, and that definitely has them worried. And this could be also, as we touched upon last week, why Poland is expanding its military. Poland is treading this fine line, trying to bifurcate the EU and America. On the one hand, appealing on America in order for America to add pressure to the EU to lay off the pressure on Poland. But America isn't really going to do that. It's going to do a stick and carrot routine with Poland. The other thing that America, I think, is doing is America definitely wants the EU weakened. And now, I don't say that America unanimously wanted that. I think the clique around Obama and Hillary did not necessarily want that. I think they saw another path forward, but I think the more pragmatic and right wing elements within the elite saw um, instead that the path forward was going to be around uniting the Anglosphere as a separate entity and to um, cleave Britain from the EU was an important matter. I can't, of course, prove any of this,
Well, I mean that
but
that does get into some of the things that what was his name? General Flynn, who was Trump's original national security advisor, love him or hate him, he had very good diagnosis on the state of the American empire. And this idea that we can't be the global policeman anymore, we have to cede some power to other regional powers, such as Russia, such as Turkey, such as Israel, etc., etc. And I don't know if he pushed for this exactly. I know that he was, of course, more pro Brexit, being on the right wing side, but did sort of push for that Anglosphere pact, if you will, that these countries that have a common language, culture, and heritage have to band
Yeah.
together in order to preserve that against a increasingly multipolar world with countries like Russia, China, the European Union and their growth, and even again increasingly other outlier powers like Turkey or maybe even Japan in the absence of an American influence. But I do think you bring up a good point that it got down to that debate in the American elite where the very ideologically driven ones who tend to be more on the left, more on the liberal side, were like, no compromise can be made, no can be given. Whereas you had the people who were, again, not even necessarily on our side, want to perpetuate a lot of things that we do hate still, but we're much more pragmatic about it, and we're also willing to give the American people many more concessions, at least theoretically, which are people like Flynn and, again, arguably Trump. But and we've touched on this previously before, where it seems like the Biden administration has taken a lot of that Flynn foreign policy, as I termed it, and realized, wow, a lot of this is actually right. Is it still too late to implement this? And I think that a lot of Biden's early foreign policy could be attributed to something like that. Nowadays, it's, again, we're just sort of in a ship without a captain, which is what it feels like right now. Even Kamala has been conspicuously quiet. You haven't heard much from really anyone out of the cabinet, anyone out of the White House beyond these most recent, of course, mandate things. It's been again, it's been eerily silent, and maybe it's because we're so used to the Obama Trump paradigm where the president was in the media 24/7. But even a more closed off president, like, say, a Bush Jr., or certainly a Bush Sr., or I suppose Clinton was a bit of a media whore himself, but again, even compared to some of the more closed off presidents we have in most recent decades, it seemed like Biden especially is so. And of course, there are the stories about his alleged incident in the Vatican and him dozing off at that climate change summit. So maybe that's for reasons that are obvious to us, or maybe there's something even deeper than that. Who knows? But it,
Um, I mean, I think basically, I'll, you know, I here's the way I'll put it. I think that, there was a 20-year period between, let's say, 1991, 92, maybe 93 to 2010, 12, 13, where America had to make good on becoming the hegemonic power of the world, and in order to push certain globalization agendas forward. And I think when you're looking at the Obama and Clinton camp, that's the camp that you're looking at, right? They pragmatically do not see how this can happen without the EU and the Anglosphere working together. And to some extent, we still see great cooperation happening there, although the fractures now are obvious, especially after AUKUS. And I think an even more pragmatic branch of American power sought to encourage, particularly the Tories in Britain, to break off from the EU, because I think they felt this was no longer something that they could manage. And it is a fallback measure in order to maintain the the core elements of the empire. Uh, there have been a few times where Germany and France have not gone along with what it was that America wanted from them. And the best example of this, of course, besides, the war in Iraq, is, you know, uh, 13 years later, the war in Ukraine. So it is obvious that, I guess, to them, to this even more pragmatic branch of the more right wing elements of the American elites, that future cooperation and coordination is impossible. Um, Now, does that mean they want an even stronger EU? No, because I think they're afraid a stronger EU is going to be an EU that they cannot cooperate with, primarily because continental Europe has other concerns that are different than America's and even Britain's. Um, though there may be more overlap with Britain, they are different and they're more integrated with Eastern Europe. Britain has interests, but Britain doesn't have the same level of integration, except let's say except with Poland. Um, so, anyways, that's what I think it comes down to is the way they're reading the tea leaves, the geopolitical tea leaves. This is what has caused this. But I think when you look at what's in store for the EU, the kind of inflation that's happening in America is also happening in Europe. And 10 years ago we were talking about yeah, 9, 10 years ago we were talking about the state of the southern EU countries like Portugal, Italy, and Greece, particularly Greece. But that inflation and those troubled times are coming even for the two giants of the EU, which are France and Germany.
Oh, certainly, and I think that explains it all very aptly, and also is yet again something else that is extremely embarrassing for the regime. And getting into that, we have some news about both Iran and Syria. I'll start with the Iranian news because it's much shorter, and in my opinion, it's frankly a bit more humorous. Where you almost had this revival of the 2019 tanker skirmishes. I'm sure you'll all recall over the spring summer
Yep.
2019 where American tankers would be seized, Iran would allegedly sabotage all these tankers, whatever. But what happened was American forces seized one of the Iranian tankers, and then Iranian forces actually counter seized it. Now you recall this was a big story. This is something we needed to react to in 2019. This is something where Trump ordered a strike but then called it off last minute. And yet again, this is
Yes.
something that hasn't even been addressed in the mainstream media as a whole. The fact that this tanker war is still going on in the Gulf, in the Middle East as a whole, and I'm sure, and like not even from like the neoconservative perspective, where they're saying, "Oh, look how weak Biden is on Iran. He's making us less safe. He's making the world less safe." You haven't even heard that nonsense from them. Funny enough, they're actually
Yeah.
all focused on China and Taiwan and all that nonsense now, to the point where who would have thought that anything could have drawn their focus away from Iran? It really makes you wonder what China's really up to if it's that important. But with that aside, looking at this, this is yet again another thing that the world's most powerful navy, that the navy responsible for guarding global trade and keeping the seas open and free, gets not only their not only do they seize this tanker in the first place, but they get driven off of it without even a fight. And again, I'm sure the rules of engagement, brought down from on high is like, hey, don't fire on these people, don't open, into gunfights because we don't want to cause a war here, at least not yet. And frankly, with some of my speculation with Iran, I think that the bang for blood with Iran, that chapter has more or less ended. I think we got into that a few months ago with Biden's negotiations with the JCPOA. That more or less that was off the table now that that era is effectively over. But again, just that although it's one tanker on top of everything else, and we'll get into some of the
Yep.
serious stuff too, to the point where it's like, and it does make you wonder with other countries starting to take more of a responsibility for their own defense and interests, like for example France, even Australia, a few other European countries. If this will really question the base of the American empire's geopolitical power in terms of naval supremacy, will nations start looking for a more reliable protector of the seas if this sort of thing continues to happen? Will they begin to take on that burden themselves? Even though realistically, there's only a few countries that I think would actually be able to maintain that. Or again, you could get a network of regional uh, trade hegemons, so to speak. Where of course I don't anyone is going to match the power of the American Navy, at least in raw terms, anytime soon. But for example, France could be the dominant power in the European sphere, possibly competing with the Russians and so far as that's concerned, or Australia in the South Pacific could be the main counter to China, or Japan could begin their naval expansion. But again, since the end of World War II, with all these countries that had their naval capabilities decimated, it's been agreed, even with the Cold War going on, that it would be the role of the American Navy to take up the role the British Navy once held as protector of the seas. And as the world becomes multipolar, I think the idea of one protector of the seas, so to speak, is going to fade, whereas countries are going to start relying more on themselves and their direct allies, so to speak. I mean, Belgium, I doubt, is going to be able to guard its own international trade. They'll probably appeal to, for example, a France or a UK, or a lot of these other small, no offense, pissant European countries that whose sovereignty depends on the guarantee of a much larger country. I mean, maybe more so in previous times. Again, I doubt Germany is going to push into Belgium again or try to form a Fourth Reich or whatever nonsense these sort of people say. That's depending on your opinion on the European Union, whether that's the Fourth Reich or not. But I digress. Um, Not nearly cool enough to be a Fourth Reich in my opinion. But with that being said, again, I think the idea that we're going to live in this multipolar world with this unipolar control of the seas is an idea that needs to be dismissed. Not that it's an idea I see commonly, and but you still do see it out there that there's just this assumption because it's been that way for, I would say, pretty much everyone alive watching the show, unless we have some really really old timers out there. In which case, welcome. We appreciate your views regardless of age. But point being is like unless you're like from the silent generation, for your entire life, the American Navy has controlled the seas and has controlled global trade and security of global trade. And it's unfathomable, even for, I would say, people like us, just because of how used to it we are, to think of, for example, countries guarding their own trade or appealing to other countries that aren't the United States to guard their own trade. But I do think with these incidents with the tankers of the past few years, and especially as China increases in navy power, not that China has this, immense navy or anything, but I don't think it's unrealistic to believe that other countries will start to take these responsibilities and responsibilities for defense in general, as we saw with Poland most recently, more into their own hands and more into regional hands.
Yes, quite right. The footage itself was spectacular. I was watching it on Telegram as America seized the tanker. I thought that was a done deal because, of course, they'd done something like this previously with tankers headed to Venezuela or Lebanon or Syria. And then, for the Iranians to immediately seize it back, right, with these schools, if you will, of tiny boats, armored though. Well, let's say they have guns fitted on them, but really, I mean, they're not really a match. But I would suppose that several of them have torpedoes on board, and so there's just too many to deal with. And so they swarmed, and I believe there was a helicopter landing on the tanker itself in order to steer it back. And there you have it. And as you say, no coverage whatsoever. Um, I mean, Biden has his hands full. He's immensely unpopular right now. Even over half of the Democrats, registered Democrats, believe he's doing a terrible job, or at least a bad job. Um, so, these sorts of bad news that kind of exposes the weakness of the empire is something they're not willing to cover because it affects them directly. Before it was like Trump's ruining the empire. Well, now it's just the empire.
Yes, Trump, insofar as I think he was rhetorically useful for us, was also very rhetorically useful for them because all the failures and
Great
shortcomings
point.
of the regime could be passed off onto Trump. That clearly he's the problem with this. And look, we didn't have these problems under Bush, under Obama. Just ignore all that stuff. It was clearly Trump, and once we get somebody, once we get the right guy back in, we can turn this ship around. And with that being said, moving on to Syria with all of this. And it's been a pretty big week in northern Syria in particular. I'll start out with the. I suppose we did touch on this a little last week, but you did have Russians set up a base in SDF controlled Syria, in the so called Syrian Democratic Forces controlled Syria. And you even had explosions and against like sounds of like gunfire and like live fire drills coming from joint Russian Syrian military drills in northeastern Syria, which again shows, I think, is one of those other things, the decrease of American influence. And I think, especially as Turkey ramps up its operations there, the so-called SDF, these Kurdish forces, and with their 90% Arab population, mind you, something like that, it's some let's put it this way, supermajority Syrian Arab population in northeastern Syria are now more eager to come to the table when it comes to negotiations than they've been since about late 2018, early 2019, when the first speculations of American withdrawal picked up. But you also had, again, number of ISIS attacks out of, again, central Syria right there, I'm sure, as you can see on the map. And also, a chief recruiter of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has been assassinated in greater Idlib. And that just plays into the big news of Idlib this week. And insofar as who was responsible for it, it was speculated that it's again one of these rival militant groups operating out of Idlib. That it wasn't even Syrian intelligence or Russian forces that, or Iranian-backed forces that got rid of again the main recruiter of the main opposition force. And you look at the operations right now. I'm sure you can see on the map. It has just been an even deeper push into the greater Idlib area for the past several weeks now. And as we were saying, I believe it was about 3 weeks ago, that we're on the precipice of some big Russian Syrian operation in the Idlib area, in the Idlib province. It's coming to fruition now, and it's looking like what I thought it was going to be. And I'm going to once again take the opportunity to say that, yeah, summer of 2021 was the last summer Idlib will be under rebel control. And looking at this map, unless there's some massive change of fortune, now there is speculation that the White Helmets are being moved back in to play their usual tricks, but judging on how that worked out the past few times, even if they are, how effective will they be? Again, you don't even have Biden responding to the American sailors getting, again, who sees the tanker getting the tanker counters. They still haven't responded to that failure. They haven't responded to Russian Belarus. I have a hard time believing that they're going to try this other Assad committing atrocities on his own people so we can launch strikes in Syria. I mean, Biden hasn't launched any strikes in Syria, at least in an official capacity, since those strikes back at the end of February of this year. And again, as you're saying, he has his hands full. He's very unpopular. And just generally with the American political discourse, unless it's the China-Taiwan issue for whatever reason, there seems to be very little interest in any other foreign theater than we have to make sure Taiwan doesn't get taken over by the Chi-Coms, or the occasional concern for Israel over the Jerusalem and Palestine issue. But even that has dissipated. That was several months ago. That was like 6 months ago at this point, half a year ago. Time flies, doesn't it? But again, certainly no
Mhm.
energy is to be spared from the American people, not even the American regime, when it comes to the Assad coalition, if you will, further advance into Idlib and northwestern Syria, and even northeastern Syria at this point, with the establishment of that Russian base.
Yeah, I mean, this is the second base that the Russians have set up in northern Syria. The other one, the older one, is at a airport in kind of north central, slightly eastern Syria, right along the border. There are both SDF and Syrian Arab Army troops there. Um, they're kind of jointly working together. Uh, the SDF controlled, the inner, the inner towns, if you will. The SAA is on the border. They have a common enemy here. It's Turkey, and Turkey's, uh, disgruntled jihadi army, which is about 20,000 right now. But as you pointed out, Another HTS leader has been assassinated, probably again by rival groups. And I think one of the reasons why Turkey is stalling on an advance, even though they are bringing in tanks, heavy artillery equipment, armored vehicles, thousands of soldiers, they are still not willing to advance right now. And it could be because, although 20,000 is a very impressive number, one has to understand that there are, internal divisions within these groups. Now, it is under what, the this group is called the Syrian National Army, which is a rebrand of the Syrian Free Army, which I can't remember anymore whether honestly it was being funded by the CIA or the Pentagon. You have to go way back to some of the congressional hearings with Graham Lindsay, with Lindsey Graham, where he's astonished that there's only 5 fighters, and it's I mean, it's an absurd moment. But anyhow,
Yeah, all the way
um,
back like 2014, 2015. So back when Syria was
yeah,
under the control of ISIS from everything. Pretty much the eastern half of the country was under control of ISIS at that point, and much different dynamic than what we're looking at today.
yes. Although some dynamics that were established in early 2020 are still going on. So what we're seeing is bombing of Damascus suburbs and the areas further outlining the Damascus region by Israel, and attacks by ISIS. This is meant to sap the energy of the Syrian army. So as soon as they put out one fire in one region of Syria, another one fires up. Um, it's and in this case, the Israelis knocked out like not necessarily military hardware, but where stores of military hardware are kept. So this is the supply chain problem that they're hoping to create in order to uh, basically impede the progress of the Syrian army, especially if battle did break out. That could be another reason why Erdogan is hesitant to attack, because coordination with Israel um, is showing that maybe they haven't crippled the Syrians well enough to ensure him a swift victory. Because of course, if he loses, it's going to be a big loss for him. Um, he's been involved in this war right from the beginning, and he's been occupying Syrian territory now for over 5 years, slightly over. And his country's economy is not in good shape. There is some polarization already taking place there, and America wants him out, but America will tolerate him to a degree because he's an impediment to Assad and the Russians to some extent. At the same time, though, he is a lot of trouble for the Kurds, and the Americans also depend on the Kurds, particularly for intelligence, both in Syria and in Iraq. Americans they still have a few small bases in Iraq, but they need intelligence anyways. So um, it's an insane dynamic situation, right? You've got Turkey and Israel working together, but at the same time, Turkey and Israel are not, generally screwing over the Kurds, but that's what everybody does. And the Kurds allow it to happen because they're very ambitious and patient. And you have the Americans trying to play both sides of this coin. So where they both help the Kurds and they you know look the other way with regards to the Turks, and they try to help out Israel. So
Oh, certainly. And again, it's becoming much more of an untenable situation in the Middle East again as it continues to fracture. And really, maybe you could say Obama had the most foresight of any of these people, even though I wouldn't give Obama nearly that much credit. that he saw the way the tides were turning and tried to come to an understanding with Iran to realize that in order to stay relevant in the Middle East, you have to ally yourself with up and coming power, and also the 2016 coup in Turkey, this 2016 coup attempt to try to remove that thorn in his side, again, Obama's parting shot to Erdogan, which really, you could say, of course, he was deeply involved in Syria before all of this, but really started us on the Erdogan we know today was the attempt at coup and its subsequent failure. So, with that being said, perhaps it'll go down history as much as I may detest him otherwise. Perhaps Obama, or at least his foreign policy team, had very good insight on what direction the Middle East was going in that regard, even though
Hmm.
that's, I would say, despite the very odd Syria policy of getting rid of Assad and turning the country into another Libya, so to speak, which again it doesn't quite mesh with the other two moves taken, but it
That's a good point. It doesn't. The other moves are very realistic. But I honestly think that the whole question of Syria was basically part of it was to appease Israel, and part of it was really to block Russia.
oh certainly, and I would say that, or the third angle you can put in that, it's like, oh, we're willing to parlay with Iran, but we also have to show them who's in charge. One of those sort of things. So,
Yeah.
I mean, with all that being said, it's uh, just even talking about the Obama Middle East, just it's such a wild contrast to what it is today. And like, of course, you could say like, oh, Trump is responsible for a lot of what's happened today. And now I would agree to some extent, but not any of Trump's actions, but his presence and his more so
Mm.
lack of actions by Syria does look like what it was today. Now, I don't even hazard to guess what a Hillary administration would have done to Syria, or any of the other candidates, pretty much, and barring any of the other viable candidates. I just say anyone who had a snowball's chance in hell, who had more than a snowball's chance in hell of getting into office, probably would have. This map would not look like it does today, and really, again, yet another blemish on the American empire with this whole situation in Syria, with this country that was once under the control of, again, half its territory was under the control of ISIS. You had them in the outskirts of Damascus, threatening to take the city. There were speculations that Assad had fled the country or had been killed at that point. But
Hmm.
again, and it's one of those other things that they simply don't want to talk about because it makes you wonder, well, gee, what have these past 10 years been for? What has this all been for? Why were we there fighting ISIS? Why were we there doing X, Y, or Z when this is the result? And again, it just seems like it's been, this week in particular, has been very embarrassing for the American empire. Now, not as much as the week of the Afghanistan withdrawal, but I would honestly say it's up there.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, it is an amazing turnaround, but we still wait for the the liberation of Syria. Um, we I guess we'll just have to keep waiting. Uh, the other country, of course, that I think they were interested in blocking was Iran, but I think Obama's ideas basically, or the people who advised him basically were, they thought like if you give Iran a lot of money, it's not going to expand its interest into Syria. And if we destroy Syria, then it's not something that they can do anyways. But I also think it even more so coordinates with their plans for the coup in Kiev, and of course they thought they would wrest away Crimea as well. And if they took Syria, then Russia would have literally no warm water ports at all, and it would be in a state that it was, prior to the Romanovs, to to put it in historical terms.
Yeah, I mean, even like you'd have to go back to, yeah, pre-Russian Empire to get to the point where they didn't have a warm water port. Like we're talking like Tsardom of Muscovy, like
Yeah.
late medieval era. if we're being honest. But
Yes, yeah.
uh, and yeah, like at that point, they'd either be forced to grovel to Israel or make some sort of deal similar to what China is doing. I don't know. Maybe they could be the saviors in Lebanon and get their port that way, or again strike some deal with Egypt. I would imagine they have some contingencies plan and the small chance that again Syria does go awry. But at the end of the day, Russia's only warm water ports, like they certainly weren't going to let that fall. And
Yeah.
I they turned around the situation remarkably. And with all that being said, it only continues in Syria, and things also tend to get worse in Lebanon as well. So
Hmm.
I I think these last couple months of the year are going to be very interesting insofar as the Middle East is concerned, insofar especially as Syria is concerned. Something to really keep our
Yeah.
eye on. And that's all I had for this episode. Ran a little longer than I wanted to. There were a couple other things I wanted to get to, but nothing drastic or major. We gave you all the big important stuff. That first segment of the show about the domestic news went on much longer than I would have expected. I hope you guys did enjoy it though, because there was certainly a lot of ground to cover. But you know what?
There was.
It's all a panoramic view of the current state of the American empire, which is what I like to think I do with this show. And it seems like you guys tend to at least agree or enjoy enough to keep coming back every week, in which case, thank you. And we will certainly see you guys next week, and goodbye.
Thank you and take care.